Hello everyone, my name is Bekem and today I will be presenting our research titled Biophilic Design in the Design Studio, Assessing Adequacy Beyond Aesthetics. Biophilic design is often celebrated for its health benefits, yet in the context of higher education, it is frequently misunderstood as a purely decorative element. This study moves beyond the greenery to investigate whether our design studios are truly meeting the cognitive and physiological needs of students. We will explore how nature integrated space can function not just as beautiful rooms but as vital pedagogical tools for creativity. Today, I will guide you through our research following a logical progression from context to solution. First, we will define the design studio as our signature pedagogy and look at the intense culture it creates. Next, I will highlight the problem, focusing on the research gap and the cognitive fatigue that students face within these high pressure environments. In the third section, I will introduce biophilic design, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a scientific framework for restoration using theories like ERT and SRT. Then I will move into our research, explaining the funnel methodology I used to select 7 globally recognized case studies. Finally, we will divide into results, discussion, and the conclusion, where I will present the comparative metrics and conclude with future recommendations for designing restorative studio habits. I would like to begin by defining the heart of design education, the design studio. As it is noted, the studio is not merely a classroom, it is the discipline's signature pedagogy and the central creative learning environment. Here, Donald Schoen's principle of reflection in action is fundamental, where students engage in a learning by doing approach that simulates professional practice. However, as Cabane and colleagues assert, the successful realization of this pedagogical model depends heavily on a supportive spatial framework. This is why modern studio typologies, as described by Salama, have evolved into open plan configurations designed to maximize flexibility and peer-to-peer interaction. However, this pedagogical model has a challenging side. Dutton describes this as a hidden curriculum that depends prolonged cognitive focus and continuous creative output. This distinct studio culture is defined by cause through its reality of extended working hours, chronic sleep deprivation, and high-stake public critics. Collectively, these factors impose significant psychological and physiological strain on students. Consequently, the quality of the physical environment is no longer just a background detail, it becomes a critical determinant of students' well being and their ability to sustain such intense academic pressure. Because of these intense demands, the studio frequently evolves into what students call a second home. Given this prolonged occupancy, the physical space functions as a third teacher, an active participant that can either facilitate or hinder the learning process. As Hoff and Erberg highlight, the creative process is multifaceted. While it thrives on social interaction, it also depends on periods of individual concentration and cognitive recharging. Therefore, the architectural organization of the studio must be nuanced enough to accommodate a broad spectrum of activities, bringing the gap between high energy collaboration and the solitary moments essential for creativity. Despite the wealth of data on biophilia, there is a significant paradox in the current literature. As Yeller points out, research is heavily skewed toward primary and secondary schools. However, post secondary environments where cognitive demands are arguably at their peak remain significantly understudied. Furthermore, as noted by Yilmaz and Aitan, most existing studies rely on subjective surveys or isolated cases. There is a clear methodological void. We lack standardized quantitative data that compares how biophilic patterns are actually distributed across different architectural studios and climatic contexts. This is the gap our research aims to fill. The problem isn't just a lack of research, it is a lack of functional support for the student's brain. As we have discussed, creativity requires periods of solitary focus, yet Kaplan's theory warns us that these activities drain our cognitive resources. While educators acknowledge the need for restoration, there's a critical mismatch in how we design these spaces. We must ask, are we providing the necessary refuge for deep concentration, or are we just creating beautiful rooms? As Peters and Depenne argue, integrating these restorative parameters is a fundamental necessity for cognitive endurance, yet it is often treated as a secondary stylistic choice. This brings us to the core of our research, the distinction between superficial and holistic design. As Browning and colleagues observed, many applications fall short of the nature of the space intended by theoretical frameworks. We see a trend where biophilical design is stuck at a level of skin deep applicability, restricted to easy to apply decorative patterns like potted plants. This creates what Zong calls an ocularitic bias. We satisfy the eye, but we miss the physiological depth provided by multisensory experiences. This sensory gap suggests that current studios might look green on the surface while failing to function as a truly restorative ecosystem for the creative mind. The psychological benefits of this approach are supported by two primary theories. First, Kaplan's attention restoration theory explains that the intense directed attention used by design students is a finite resource that leads to fatigue. Nature provides the soft fascination needed to refresh this resource. Complementing this, Ulrich's stress reduction theory shows how natural elements like views of greenery or organic materials can trigger rapid psychological recovery by activating our parasympathetic nervous system. Together, these theories provide the robust scientific basis for why nature is an essential fuel for the cognitive endurance requiring in the architectural studios. Expanding this to design education, we argue that biophilic design should be utilized as a pedagogical tool rather than just a stylistic one. Research by McGee and Park demonstrates that moving beyond plans and integrating deep biophilic attributes directly facilitates ideation and increases student confidence. It aligns perfectly with the goals of contemporary studio. It doesn't counter the architectural intent. Instead, it acts as a necessary layer that supports both the high energy social collaboration and the quiet restorative moments students need. This confirms that nature of the space patterns are not mere decorations but are integral to academic success in creative fields. To move from theory to quantifiable data, I adopted the 16 pattern of biophilic design framework proposed by Browning and colleagues. As you can see on the screen, this framework is divided into three distinct categories that addresses different layers of the human experience. First, nature in the space addresses the direct physical presence of nature. These elements like dynamic lights and airflow are essential for physiological stress reduction and visual acuity in a studio settings. Second, we have natural analogs. These are indirect symbolic references such as natural materials or biomorphic shapes that provide a sensory connection to the local ecology even without living in the system. Finally, and most importantly for the study, is the nature of the space. These patterns deal with spatial configurations like prospect, which allows for surveillance, and refugee, which provides a protected place for deep concentration. These are rooted in evolutionary psychology and directly parallel the cognitive demands of the design process. In this research, I utilized this table as a comparative matrix by identifying architectural evidence for each of these 14 patterns. I was able to translate qualitative spatial features into quantitative data, allowing for a rigorous assessment across divergent global contexts. Building on the theoretical framework, the study aims to address the identified gap by conducting a comparative content analysis of globally recognized university design studios. The core of my investigation is driven by one primary question: which biophilic design elements are actually implemented in design studios across different countries? Beyond just identifying these elements, I also ask if there is a disparity between easy to apply visual features and deep spatial configurations. By answering these questions, we can determine whether current studios are truly restorative environments or if they follow a more superficial, aesthetic driven trend in different global contexts. To answer our research questions, we selected 7 globally recognized case studies that represent a diverse range of architectural responses and climatic contexts. As you can see on the screen, our sample set spans from the Jacob Institute and SNHU in the USA to the Melbourne School of Design in Australia. We have also included the MSAP in India, the award-winning NUS in Singapore, Özyeğin University in Turkey, and the School of Design in Seoul. Using ArcDaily as a standard design website and database, we analyzed each of these institutions through their architectural photographs and technical drawings. This global spread is crucial because it allows us to see if biophilic principles are being applied as a universal standard or if they vary significantly across different educational cultures. This matrix represents the core of our research, where we transferred qualitative architectural observations into quantitative data. Each of the 7 studios was evaluated across the 14 patterns based on undeniable visual and technical evidence. As you can see, the total biophilic scores range from a minimum of 3 out of 14 to a maximum of 9 out of 14, with the NUS School of Design leading the group. However, the real story lies in the frequency of occurrence shown at the bottom. Patterns like dynamic and diffuse light achieved 100% frequency, meaning they were presented in every single case. Similarly, visual connection with nature occurred in over 70% of the studios. We can call these the low-hanging fruit, the patterns that are easier to implement and, more importantly, easier to see. Now, I want to draw your attention to a critical point regarding our methodology. You will notice 0% scores in categories like non-visual connection or non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. It is important to clarify that because this study relied on a visual content analysis of photographs and drawings, These non-visual elements such as scent, subtle sound, or textures are simply could not be verified through a lens. This is a key limitation of the study. These categories are marked as zero, not necessarily because they don't exist in the buildings, but because they are invisible to a purely visual assessment. However, with this limitation in mind, we see a significant neglect of complex spatial patterns like mystery or refugee, which are visible but still missing. This confirms a major disparity. While modern studios are becoming greener and brighter, they are still struggling to provide the deep, multisensory, and protective configurations essential for long term cognitive endurance. Building directly on that limitation, we arrive at a significant discussion point: the ocularitic bias. In architectural design, while 100% of the studios we studied successfully integrated visual elements like dynamic light and greenery, there was a complete absence of recorded non-visual stimuli. Now, as I mentioned, while this is a result of our visual methodology, it reveals a much deeper issue, a representation gap. Think about it this way: if these biophilic elements like acoustics, scent, or tactile textures are not being captured in architectural photography or technical documentation, it is strongly suggested they are not being prioritized as part of the studio's core identity. We tend to document and celebrate what we can see, but we often neglect the invisible multisensory depth that true psychological restoration requires. By designing primarily for the eyes, we are essentially creating Instagrammable spaces that might look restorative in a photo, but fail to function as a complete ecosystem for a student's body and mind. This gap reminds us that for a design studio to be truly healthy, we must move beyond the image and start prioritizing the senses that we cannot capture with a camera. Another vital finding is the imbalance between prospect and refugee. Modern studios prioritize prospect with a 71% frequency to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and open collaboration. However, the refugee pattern, which provides that necessary privacy for deep concentration, scored significantly lower at 43%. This creates a pedagogical conflict. While we support high energy interaction, we are failing to provide the withdrawal zones. Students need to recharge their cognitive energy. To sustain long term creativity and mitigate the stress of the hidden circle, our studios must balance these open vistas with protected biophilic hooks. In conclusion, my research demonstrates that biophilic design in university studios is still in its infancy, focusing on what is visible rather than what is functional. We have masterfully integrated light and views, but the deeper spatial and sensory patterns remain neglected. Moving forward, we must stop treating biophilia as a decorative extra and recognize it as a pedagogical necessity for cognitive endurance. Future research should expand beyond visual analysis to include on site measurements of acoustics and thermal comfort. Our goal must be to transform the design studio from a simple workplace into a restorative habitat that protects and fuels the creative minds of our students. And this is our references if you would like to see or research further. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope this analysis has provided a new perspective on how we can bridge the gap between architectural pedagogy and biophilic restoration. Thank you very much for listening. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you may have, and please feel free to reach out to me via email or via this platform if you would like to discuss this research further.